Well, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon to talk about what lower elementary looks like at Green Spring Montessori School. My name is Margaret Jarrell. I'm the elementary director at Green Spring. I was an elementary guide there for many years and then went into admissions before I moved to Florida with my family. And now I have a support role with the school from afar. And Bevan, take it away.
Sure. My name is Bevan. I am the lower elementary dual language guide on campus right now. This is my second year as a guide in lower elementary, my third year working in elementary, and my fifth year at the school. I love the elementary child and that age group, and it was the second I stepped on campus there, I knew that that's where I wanted to be. So I'm happy to be here to talk to you all about that today as well.
All right, Bevan, are we good to go on the shared screen?
Looks good.
Okay, great. Well, we call this event Looking Forward to Lower Elementary, whether you're a current third-year Children's House parent or have a younger child. We're always glad to have you thinking about the next step in your Montessori journey. And we like to start with a quotation from Dr. Montessori. This one is particularly meaningful to me. Knowledge can be best given where there's eagerness to learn. So this is the period when the seed of everything can be sown. The child's mind being like a fertile field, ready to receive what will germinate into culture. And you've probably heard that term absorbent mind when referring to the Children's House level. And we really think of the elementary level as the age where we're sowing these seeds, planting seeds, and then letting all these different ideas and inspirations and abilities blossom. So a little bit of review here for those of you newer to Montessori. Her educational philosophy is based on her observations of children as a scientist, a doctor, an educator. And she noticed that there were 4 planes of development that children progress through. And the first, infancy, she called age 0 to 6, although we break that down even further, 0 to 3 and 3 to 6. And of course, 3 to 6 is the stage at which children are in our Children's House environments. And here they're just having such growth physically. And as I mentioned, this is the age of the absorbent mind. The second plane of development she called childhood, from age 6 to 12. This would encompass lower and upper elementary. Then adolescence, 12 to 18, sort of maturity and beyond. So we're not going to go super in depth, but I just wanted to point out a few differences between the child in the first plane of development and the second plane of development. Oh, I lost my first plane of development slide somehow. Well, first plane of development, again, is a time of very dramatic physical growth. Children have a huge desire for physical independence and this absorbent mind. They crave order and routine and love repetition. Here it is. And Dr. Montessori said it's sort of as if the child at this age is saying, help me do it alone. If you've ever waited for your toddler to put on his or her own shoes and you're in a hurry to get out the door, you know, this desire can be very frustrating, but it's also a beautiful thing because it's the child's innate drive to develop as a human being. But now at the elementary age, around age 6, the child moves into this different phase. So physically, you're seeing their limbs elongate, teeth starting to fall out. Interestingly, you're starting to see the child's ability to think abstractly. Not everything is just in concrete terms. And the elementary child, instead of craving repetition, craves variety in their experiences. And we'll talk about what this looks like in the classroom. This is an age of developing imagination. It's also an age where children tend to take this great interest in morality and justice. This is where you hear a lot of, it's not fair, you know, and there's also hero worship and at this age, and it's really an age of social exploration. So whereas our younger children engaged in parallel play and the Children's House classroom tends to be very quiet and peaceful sometimes, so you could hear a pin drop, the elementary classroom has this buzz about it because there's an energy as children are engaging in these social experiences.
And another big thing too that I always like to, and this is touched upon it, but I always like to share with people that one big difference between that first plane, so toddlers in Children's House, and elementary is that, and you might notice it too with your children, from 0 to 6, they're really looking at their immediate surroundings and looking at themselves, right, and what they can do in that environment. But when they hit that 5, 6, 7 year old mark, they are immediately starting to look outwards, and they want to know everything that they don't know yet, right? They want to be outside of the house, outside of their immediate surroundings, not just physically, but especially mentally. So it's a great time for, as it says, social exploration and mental exploration as well.
So Dr. Montessori really felt that this was its own distinct stage, that the child between the ages of 6 to 12, it's not just a direct continuation of what's gone before, but there's actually a change in the child. And it makes the child is primed at this age for the acquisition of culture, just as the younger child was absorbing all these sensorial experiences through the environment. This is the time at which, like Bevan said, that children want to understand how the world works and their place in it. So it's really a unique opportunity to dig into this wide and broad curriculum that we cover in the elementary years. So we call the curriculum at the elementary level, we say it's based on cosmic as education. And we're not talking about something mystical there, but really the idea that we start with the big, big picture. In a lot of traditional education, the focus starts very narrowly, my home, my neighborhood, my city, my state, my country. In Montessori education, we start with the universe. And we spark interest and curiosity and wonder about the world. And we give students a framework in which to fit all these other lessons in different areas of the curriculum and sort of understand this big picture. So we're really trying to feed upon the curiosity that Bevan referenced that children innately have at this age. They're asking these how and why questions and starting to want to understand their place in the world. And so this is where we begin. This picture is a lesson on a material called the long black strip, which is a very impressionistic lesson. Do you want to describe a little bit about this lesson, Bevan? It's so neat.
Sure. So there are several great stories that we tell to the elementary children at the beginning of the year. They usually are told over the course of a couple of weeks. And one of those great lessons is, well, two of them. One is the coming of the universe and the coming of life. And then we also talk about the coming of human beings. And the black strip really is this, it's very, very long. In fact, I've heard the original black strip was about 10 times longer than the one that we have now. And it's meant to unroll slowly as we're retelling the coming of life story. And, oh, this is how the universe was created, and this is when life came. And then at the very, very end, there's a little tiny red strip that you couldn't see in this picture. And that is how long humans have been around. So the whole time the children are following us go like through sidewalks and sometimes into the parking lot, depending, and reviewing sort of all the things that have happened before human beings have come into existence, to show, how much has been put into place before we were even, part of the world and the universe.
Yeah, it's really the child's first timeline and understanding what a small portion, of human history takes up of our universe's history. As Bevan mentioned, there are 5 great lessons which are introduced every year all the way through upper elementary. They're not meant as anything to be memorized, or there's no one fact that is so important. Really, these are meant to spark excitement and imagination, and again, provide this framework so that everything else that is learned in every other area has a greater meaning, because we can see how it fits in to this big picture. So the first lesson is the birth of the universe, which we introduce by reading creation myths and stories from around the world in different time periods, and then telling the story, as our most current research tells us, of what scientists say how our universe was born, all the, how our solar system evolved, how our planet was created. Then the second great lesson discusses the coming of life and how life evolved from those first single cell organisms all the way up to humans. Bevan, do you want to talk a little bit about the last three great
Sure.
lessons?
Yeah, so the coming of life, as Margaret was saying, we start with the smallest organism that would have existed, all the way up through eventually human beings. And again, that black strip is another sensorial way that we show that. The coming of human beings, we talk about just that, where human beings started from what we know through history. And that is a lot of, and those first three lessons especially are introducing so many different parts of the academics that we'll get into in a minute. But the coming of humans, we're talking about where humans came from, what they needed in order to succeed and continue to evolve and progress through the time that we know that they've been around. The story of writing, we talk about all the ways that humans have communicated through writing in the past, and that's really getting into language, helping introduce the language curriculum. And then the story of numbers is helping introduce art. No, I'm just joking. It's helping introduce math, right? And like how everyone used numbers throughout the ages. And that's also a big history one too, because we see how different civilizations would have quantified, different numbers, or why they would have used them before.
So here we take these beautiful, big, exciting stories, and let's dive in and sort of talk about how they branch off into these different areas of the curriculum. And we'll talk about each one. So science, those first two great lessons are such beautiful introductions to all these different areas of science, because from that birth of the universe, you're talking about how stars are born, how solar systems form. So you're diving deep into astronomy, meteorology. We introduce the first great lessons by actually doing a series of science experiments that introduce a bunch of chemistry and physics concepts, as well as the scientific methods, so that students are then able to recreate some of those experiments on their own. As the continents form and the tectonic plates move, we're getting into geology. As we talk about the evolution of life on Earth, we're digging into biology and botany and all these areas. And within each of these areas, we then have other key lessons that we're introducing to children at different levels as they're ready for them and interested in them. But again, it all ties in, to these initial stories. Geography and history also grow out of these great lessons. Here you see a student using a material called a pin map. This is a direct sort of step from the puzzle maps that you've seen the children using in the Children's House, and we still have them in lower elementary. But now we have a more sophisticated material in which the student is identifying the countries, the capitals, the rivers, and major land formations with these various flags, and learning to reference a map, either in an atlas or a control map, and how to read those. Again, history, as Bevan says, evolves as we talk about how these different continents formed and how people of different cultures and in different geographical regions had to adapt and meet their fundamental needs. We start to see how different groups interacted with one another, and we begin our study of history based on that study of fundamental human needs. Culture and social studies and timelines of discovery and invention are all intertwined here. So Montessori has a very, very rich language curriculum, which of course, we spark with that great lesson. But there's so much here. Of course, moving into lower elementary, we have children reading at all different levels. We have some who may already be independent readers and some who are still very emergent readers. So we support those students where they are with a variety of different language materials. You see some girls here using grammar symbols, which is a very visual and concrete material that's used to introduce the different parts of speech. And what we thought of as diagramming sentences is done in a very visual and appealing way. Of course, we're going into writing, not only the mechanics of it, because again, some children are coming to us at this level with letter formation that's very fluid, and others that are still working on those pieces. So we'll meet them where they are to work on both handwriting and the mechanics of writing. We do a lot of word study work. So looking at different types of words, compound words, homonyms, homophones, and studying language that way, learning the etymology of words, so that we're really coming at it from lots of different angles. And of course, we have our appreciation of literature intertwined in this, so that even if a child is not yet an independent reader, they have the ability to enjoy more sophisticated pieces of literature and start learning how to analyze for character and setting and motivation and learning parts of a story. This is a very, very deep and broad part of our curriculum.
And something too to add, and Margaret touched upon it, every child is coming in at a different reading and writing level. And a big reason for that is because reading and writing is not an innate human tendency. It is not something that we were born knowing to do, unlike maybe our desire to get up and walk or things like that. So every child learns to read completely differently. And it's through a lot of the things that we'll see later in the presentation of the role of the adult to identify if there are any struggles, any obstacles with that, and know that there are a lot of variables that are going to go into it. And also it's such a, especially at that like first grade level, second grade level, because they're seeing so much different variety in the language curriculum, they're really interested in a lot of it. So it's a really, everyone is at a different level. So there's so many different approaches as to how we help the children.
And that's that's part of the beauty of the multi-age classroom, which continues at the elementary level. So by having 6 to 9-year-olds in the same room, you're already seeing this broad spectrum of students' interests and strengths and abilities, and everyone has strengths and challenges in different areas. And so there are opportunities for students to shine and be leaders in one area, and yet also have time to catch up and be nurtured and have skills reinforced in another when they need it. There's so much less comparing and competition just because of the nature of the mixed age group and the fact that everyone's doing a different thing all during the morning work cycle. So it takes a lot of that pressure to compete out of it, and keep the excitement where it belongs, which is because the work is interesting and they're innately motivated and curious to learn more. So math is another very, very deep and broad aspect of the curriculum, and one of my particular favorites just because of the ingenious materials that Dr. Montessori developed. I mean, mathematics, of course, encompasses operations, but also fractions and decimals and multiples and squares and cubes and introductions to algebra and geometry, word problems, measurement, time, money. I mean, there's so much there. And what you'll notice is that, again, there's this carryover of materials from the children's house. So again, you'll see a bead cabinet with the bead chains that the children were using to learn to count in sequential order in the children's house and learning how to skip count. Well, now they're actually learning that skip counting is multiplication, and that when they fold up those chains into squares, they can calculate the square of a number. And when they pile those squares on top of each other to build the cube, they're cubing a number. And yet, so it's all building on these foundational experiences, and yet still a very concrete introduction to these concepts that they'll understand in a completely different way because of these hands-on experiences. And we're going to come back to math in a minute, but just want to mention that in Montessori, we tend not to think of subjects as belonging in their own little compartments as much as possible. You know, we want children to appreciate and understand how everything's connected. And even though we do have enrichment guides who do additional work in teaching music and art, and we'll talk more about that, this is still just integrally interwoven into the student's daily experience. So a child may be doing research on how a certain culture met their need for shelter and actually start building a model of that out of clay, or painting a map of something. We have tone bars, just like you saw the bells in the children's house classroom. We have the tone bars in the elementary classroom. Students are learning how to write music and compose their own pieces. And in the same way, practical life and grace and courtesy and peace education are parts of the everyday experience. We're going to dig a little deeper into some of those. Grace and courtesy, which has been a cornerstone of the children's experience since they start in toddlers. You know, it started out with just learning how to say hello and greet another person or tuck in a chair. At the elementary level, it continues. They're still taking care of self and others and the environment. It's just at a more sophisticated level. We're still talking about manners, especially those skills that are needed for going out. And we'll talk about what going out is. But students may be learning how to write a letter or pick up the phone and make an appointment at a doctor's office, or what etiquette looks like when you're sitting in a theater, or how to order in a restaurant, things like that, that the children can have an immediate real world application for. And peace education continues to be a cornerstone at the elementary level. Bevan, do you want to talk a little bit about what this looks like at elementary? Because it is, I mean, you've probably heard of the peace table or the peace rows in the children's house classrooms, and that transitions a bit at the elementary level.
Yeah, so this is such a huge part of what we do, right? Peace education. And it's not one particular lesson. In fact, it's kind of rooted in all the interactions we have with each other, all the lessons that we give. It could be as simple as talking about how we interact with others around us, as Margaret was talking about before, with that grace and courtesy. A lot of it in lower elementary does have to do with conflict resolution skills, as it says right there. You know, the children, once they get to this social age, they're going to want to work with each other, and there's going to be disagreements. So as opposed to having an adult come in and say, you can't sit with you, or you go over there, or whatever, really, we want to help them build these skills to come to resolution with each other when there is disagreement. Figure out why there was the disagreement, stuff like that. Service and stewardship is a big thing that actually probably many of you that have been at the school for a little bit now know that that's something that we've done a lot of, that was our theme, I think, a couple of years ago, but really taking care of the land. We try to have outdoor environments in any Montessori school or classroom, but we have the lower elementary has like a little garden and outside, and they want to take care of that. A lot of it too in lower and upper, like pre and post COVID, is going out into our communities and seeing what we can do to help serve them as well. And just a real quick story, so this is something that I felt when I stepped onto campus for the first time, was just completely ingrained. Just the way that everyone interacted with each other, and it was completely genuine too. And I had a parent a couple of years ago who they left for another school, but I stayed in contact with them to give their child guitar lessons. And one day the parent said, I love the new school rep, blah, 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 but there's one thing that is missing, and that is just the way that you all spoke with each other. I've never seen that since, and that's when it kind of dawned on me too, that it's really just something that we do a lot of, but it's ingrained in who we are, as not just as a community at Green Spring, but also in Montessori, I believe.
Thanks, Bevan. And I love what happens at this age, because the children are becoming more dramatic and love role playing. And so at the beginning of the year, it's the students that meet and sort of come up with their community agreements or their constitution, the agreements they want to have for the classroom. And then when a whole group sort of issue arises, it can be brought up during a community meeting, and the group can debate and hash it out and brainstorm solutions. And then Bevan might even split them up into small groups and have them act out different scenarios. And I mean, it can be a really fun and engaging way to problem solve and learn these skills that then they take on with them. So the prepared environment is another constant, starting with the toddlers and into the children's house. You notice that there's a very intentional setup of the classroom. For one thing, you never see a teacher's desk or an area that is the adults. This is very much the students' environment that they take ownership of. Everything is very organized, and all the materials are put out in sequence and by subject area. You'll also see that there is space set aside for individual work, small groups to collaborate, and then whole group gatherings as well, with tons of resources available for independent research. And then with our outdoor learning environments, opportunities for outdoor learning as well. And the students own this environment. So part of that practical life work is feeding the classroom pets and watering the plants and washing the tables and setting the tables for meals. So really giving them that ownership over their space. Now, the Montessori Materials, this is probably what drew you to Montessori in the first place, or one of many things. This is something that continues to be magical at the lower elementary level. Even though the students are now making the leap into abstract understanding, but we're still rooting that abstraction on these concrete hands-on materials. This is really the bridge from Children's House. So you will see materials you recognize. And yet students crave variety now more than repetition. So instead of doing the same thing over and over and over, we might have 3 different materials that address a particular concept that students can be introduced to look at it in different ways. And so I just point out this series of pictures. Here on the left, you have the golden beads, which they've been introduced to in the Children's House. It's the most concrete representation of the decimal system, where a 1 is literally 1 bead in your hand, and 1,000 is 1,000. It feels different, it looks different, it's heavy. You're dragging all these things around and physically manipulating them and exchanging. At some point, either at the end of Children's House or in lower elementary, the student will be ready for a slightly more abstract representation of those numbers. So this middle picture is the stamp game. We now see that 1 is represented by a stamp with a 1 on it. A 10 is a stamp with a 10. They're color coded, but still physical. And when the child is adding 2 different addends, if they get to more than 10, they'll take 10 in exchange for the next place, and begin and are introduced on how to record this on paper. But what is so different from a traditional environment is that the paper learning didn't come first. The students are learning to write on the paper what they're doing and understanding with the physical materials. And they progress through a series of different lessons. They're introduced to the bead frame. At some point, there is this beautiful aha moment where the student just sees it in their mind and writes it on the paper and doesn't need the materials anymore. And this is what we're waiting for, and what we beg our parents not to rob the students of, because the way so many of us were taught is, oh, cross this out and write this here and carry this down. We didn't really know why we were doing it, but we memorized the algorithm. So instead, we ask parents to hold back and let their child have this discovery on their own. And it is the most confidence building, exhilarating moment of understanding that comes when that light bulb goes off. So we call it a very individualized curriculum because students are able to learn at their own pace. Not only do you have the 3 different age groups, but we are not confined by having to give a lesson to all the first graders at once. Instead, we can pull students for lessons based on when they are ready for that lesson, even if there's only 1 child ready for that lesson at any given time. That'll be an individual lesson. Or if a 3rd year and a 1st year are ready for the same lesson at the same time, they can come do that together. And the way we know when a student is ready is mainly through observation, making notes, working with children, seeing what they're understanding when they're ready for a new challenge, and keeping track of that progress for each individual student. So the 3-period lesson is something, it's a bit of Montessori jargon, but I wanted to come back to that here because it's another answer to that question someone asked earlier of sort of what distinguishes Montessori from other schools or more traditional types of learning at this age. Now, at the Children's House level, the 3-period lesson, which more often introducing vocabulary or a concept, like this is a hexagon, here are, and then the child would explore the hands-on materials. And then the 3rd period demonstration of knowledge might look like, show me the hexagon, or what is this? And have the child name it. The same concept applies at the elementary level, but of course now we're not just learning vocabulary or nomenclature, but here, we're digging deep into things, but the same idea is true. So the guide gives an introductory lesson, which is just a brief sharing of sort of the essence of what is needed to do further exploration. The 2nd period, which is the largest piece of the child's work, is their hands-on exploration. And then the 3rd period, which they can have a lot of decision making about how they do it, is demonstrating that they understand this concept. I'd say the main difference between Montessori and traditional education is that in traditional education, that 1st period is the bulk of it. There's not a lot of investigation, but then there's a huge priority put on demonstration of knowledge, i.e. testing. In a Montessori classroom, the guide introduces a concept. The child is really given the freedom and the gift of time to investigate. And then, of course, there is a demonstration of knowledge, but they take more ownership of that. And here in this picture, you see some girls sharing some research that they've done with their classmates. And that's how they've chosen to share knowledge of this particular study. So, Bevan, would you talk a little bit about what collaborative work looks like? Because this is also, you start to see it in Children's House, but it really explodes at the elementary level.
Sure. Yeah. So as mentioned kind of towards the beginning, and I guess throughout as well, that Children's House child, that first plane child, they're interested in exploring the things around them, but also things on their own. That doesn't mean that in Children's House you won't see group work, and I'm sure those of you that have been able to observe have seen that. But when you get to elementary, that nature of wanting to be social and wanting to collaborate is something that happens innately. Just us as human beings do it. So already the students are coming in and they are really interested in working together and on everything from just a simple math to language or to research, science, history, geography, all that. One thing too that's really beneficial for the multi-age classroom and is having, for lower elementary, for example, a third year might come down and see a first year struggling with sounding out a word or something like that, and they might show their leadership skills to come in and say, all right, let me help you out. Or maybe a group, last year we had a group that did research on elephants. They did a going out, they had someone come in, expert, talk about elephants. And that was, I believe, a first, a second, and a third year, all working, or all grade levels. There were about 4 or 5 of them working together. So there are things that it's not just only the third graders can work on this or only the first graders can work on this. It's class wide. It really gives the younger children too an opportunity to look up to what they might be doing shortly, or even if there are certain works and certain lessons that we give that maybe there's a step of it that's appropriate for someone that is having that only knows a little bit about the subject, and there might be someone that knows more about it and they have different roles, right? Another big part, as is mentioned on this slide, is time management. We some children are going to want to just work with the same person or with each other the whole time, and we want to make sure that while they're working with their friends and everything, that they know how long they're doing things for, and that they're all holding each other accountable for the work that they're doing and the shared responsibility of that work. So it's not maybe just 3 students sitting and 2 are doing it, and one is not or isn't sure. That everyone is able to, work together in a responsible way. And then again, if you get into like that elephant group I was just referring to, the elephant research group from last year, there were a couple of times where there was conflict. What kind of presentation are we going to do? Should we have a fundraiser? Should we, can I do this part or this part? There's a lot that goes into making sure that that they are all able, to work together and solve those conflicts, as we mentioned earlier.
Well, and what we've really found is that the elements of the Montessori as designed for the elementary level that really feed the students are when there are meaningful ways to engage. So rather than being given worksheets and busy work, by following the child's interest and allowing them to learn these skills in ways that are deeply meaningful and have real world applications, they really are inspired, and their interest in learning continues to be sparked and innately without having to use external rewards like stickers or candy or even praise. I mean, we're very careful to use what we call encouragement rather than praise. Because what we found and research has found is that when we overly praise students, then they begin to work for our adult validation rather than their own interest in something. And we actually rob them of what's already there when we start to impose these external reinforcements on them. What really drives them? Opportunities to work with others, an ability to go beyond the classroom, and opportunities to debate and create and connect and reflect, and solve real world problems. This is all the food they need, to keep their love of learning alive. Um, and for that reason, you see that we don't use letter grades. Instead, our reporting, we'll talk more about assessment, but we call those progress reports instead of report cards with letter grades. But with these freedoms comes responsibility. This is a tenet of Montessori, is freedom with responsibility. So yes, we give our students freedom to choose their work, and yet their responsibility is that the work is constructive and productive. And I might add that if Bevan gives a lesson and assigns a follow-up work, um, that responsibility is also to complete, that follow-up work that's asked. Student have the freedom to work in groups as long as those groups are generating meaningful discussion and debate and productively, working on their project. And they do have the freedom to talk. And that's why the volume is a little bit higher and there's a little energy, and we call it like a buzz in the room. But the responsibility is that conversation is pertinent to their work and meaningful, and that they're not distracting or taking away, the ability of another classmate to learn. Um, so freedoms can be given or structures can be put in place as needed to again meet the child where they are. Some students are not ready for all of that freedom right away, and we have to provide them more scaffolding in the beginning and then build up those skills and, slowly remove the scaffolding as they're ready to take that on themselves. So Bevan, would you talk a little bit about, we talked about the students' responsibilities but now what are the responsibilities of the guide?
Sure. So, yeah, there are a lot, and so I'll run through the ones that we have up here, and I'm sure there are going to be. I might elaborate a little bit, but inspire and spark the imagination. That's huge. I mean, if a guide or the adult in the classroom gives a lesson and it's monotone, or it's not given in a way that really does inspire and breeds that imagination with the child, then they're not going to be interested, and they're going to want to walk away and do what they were doing before, or or something else. So that's really important, to having a lot of energy. There's a lot of coffee in the in the morning, right? Like getting them excited for the lessons, and really not just the lessons, but also to be excited to be there, right? And most of the children are, especially right now. But yeah, that's a big one. Obviously giving lessons, same as Children's House, right? And a lot of these will probably be the same as Children's House, actually. But I did 3 years of training to learn. I believe at the end of the day, it's several hundred to maybe even 1,000 lessons that we can give over the course of those 6 years. And of course, we're not going to give all of them, but there's a lot of variety in what we can give. And I'll get to how we determine giving lessons in a second. Modeling grace and courtesy, right? Modeling how we want to interact with each other, how we want the children to interact. And usually that, and I'm not speaking for myself, but any guide that I've ever worked with is usually, that just comes innately. Monitoring. So monitoring and observing, really, they're trying to see what's going on in the classroom, making sure that you're constantly aware of not just the children, but also the other adults in the room. If there's an assistant in the room, to see what they're doing, how they're helping the children, things like that. Asking questions. That's that's pretty self-explanatory. Anytime a child is demonstrating they might have an obstacle or demonstrating that they have a proficiency in something, I might ask a question. And actually, I was thinking about this just a second ago when Margaret was talking about the way we don't give stickers or rewards. Anytime, and this happens all the time, anytime a child comes up to me and says, hey, Mr. Bevan, what do you think of my work? First thing I say is, well, what do you think about it? Right? And that leads into the next thing, because my job is not to tell them they did it right or they did it wrong. My job is to observe what they're doing, observe if they have understood the lesson, observe if they are understanding the concept, and also observe if they are moving forward with it. A brief example of this is, with math, if I've introduced carrying, as we know it as like the, crossing off as adults, but with the Montessori material, getting those 10 units and exchanging it for a 10 or what have you. If they're not doing something the way that has been presented in the lesson, and that's my job and the other adult's job to see that and then give the lesson again or give it in a different way that might be more appropriate or better benefit the child. And I would honestly, observing is one of the biggest things that we do as adults, and not just the guide, the assistants as well, because the assistants might have eyes somewhere where I'm not, and understanding sort of not just with academics but also behavior, what's going on there. Planning, that's every teacher does that, I guess, to some extent. Planning for the week. What lessons are we going to give based on what has been given? I keep a lot of records of what's been given, and then also in that observation realm, what has what's working, what's not. Recording the progress, as I just mentioned, through observation, seeing if they're going through it, if they need any additional support. Collaboration, that's more, for me anyways, more towards the grace and courtesy aspect, making sure that I don't ever speak to the children like they're children. I don't ever speak to them like they're anybody other than how I would want to be spoken to myself. And so sometimes that comes into play with, maybe a student wants to collaborate with their peers, and they might need an additional adult in there to help. That's a way that we could do that as well. Understanding skills and content, that goes back to understanding the different skills of the child and how that is going to relate to what we're providing them with the lessons, and then of course understanding the children's strengths, style, needs, and the way that they learn, because every child learns differently. Every single child learns differently, and that goes back into following the child. And really what we're offering in a lot of ways is, individualized lesson plans for the children, right? The lesson I'm giving to one child is not going to be the same that I give to another, or if it is the same, I might not give it the same way based on who they are and how they learn.
That's what makes the guide's job so difficult, but also so exciting. But I mean, Bevan has this massive Excel spreadsheet of every lesson in every area of the curriculum that could ever be given. And he has to track where each child is in that continuum in every single area at any given moment. So when he's planning, he's not just saying, oh, I'm teaching equivalence to the third graders on Wednesday, and then I can move on to the next thing. He has to know who's ready for that lesson, who needs to practice it again because they didn't understand it, who is ready for the next challenge, even if it's before anybody else. And so that planning is, it might change on a dime. He might have planned to give a lesson to a particular student and they're not ready for it, and he adjusts his plan. Or a grasshopper hops into the classroom and we're suddenly doing external parts of invertebrates lesson that wasn't planned, but you're just jumping into the moment. So there's a lot of flexibility and creativity involved there, but that's something Bevan does beautifully, and I have heard of students bursting into spontaneous applause after some of those great lessons in particular. So it's really special. Bevan, can you talk about the three pillars of accountability and sort of how all of this gets checked?
Sure. So this is a big one. I mean, everything's a big one, I guess. But yeah, the three pillars of accountability is a elementary Montessori kind of staple. Every elementary guide I've ever spoken with or worked with knows about this, and they might call it something different. The way I learned it was the three pillars of accountability. So really, we want the children to feel accountable for their own work. As mentioned before, we have in our classroom, in our environment, freedom and responsibility. The freedom to do things with the responsibility of certain maybe limitations if they need it. And some of the ways that we help the children hold themselves accountable for the work that they're doing and their progress on the work. The first one is the work record journal. So every day, at the beginning of the day, we will ask the children to plan their day out, open up, we'll give them every month they get a journal where they open, there's the date written on top, and they will write in what works they want to do today. And similar to my planning where I might say, oh, I want to give this lesson today, and then 5 seconds before I might change my mind because of something that happened, the children might do that too. They might write down, I want to do stamp game, I want to do a grammar box, I want to do fundamental needs of human beings, and they might not do any of it. But if they don't, that means that they've been doing something else, right? And so they would come back in during the day and write in their work record journals the things they did. As they get older, towards the end of lower elementary, really second and third grade up until, and then definitely in upper elementary, they will record the times in which they did it. How long did it take you to do this work? And then moving on from that, you go into the regular one-on-one meetings with the guide. Ideally, this is weekly, but it almost never is. It's almost bi-week or every 2 weeks, sometimes 3, depending on if there's a lot going on in the classroom, if there's a lot of great work, stuff like that. I never want to interrupt the children when they're into big things, but at the same time, we need to have these meetings. So I try to make it at least once every 2 weeks. I'll have the students come with their work record journals. We'll sit down and we'll review it and say, I might make an observation. Wow, like you're really, you might be focusing a lot on this, and that's awesome. And I love that you're working on this. What else could we work on? I might observe different patterns in their work record journal. What are the things that they like? What are the things that we might suggest them to do more? And also, how are you feeling? I mean, that's like my favorite part about the one-on-one meetings. Like, are you happy, right? Are you enjoying your work? Are you, is there something you're struggling with and you haven't had, the courage to tell me yet? I might not frame it like that, but those are really special actually, but also extremely helpful for that accountability piece. And then also we have the Common Core standards in every classroom. This is, it's definitely important for lower elementary. It's taken more into account, I think, in upper from my experience, like where the children are looking at that often because they want to see what other students in their area, in their county, whatever it is, what they're doing. So we'll have the Common Core standards, and we also in our classrooms we have what is expected from every level. There's a book, and you all might have gotten it at some point, but we have a book for that Green Spring handed out a year or two ago on
our website too, like our standard, our scope and sequence. Mm-hmm.
Right. Yes. So what this is just to help show what other children in their age group are learning and what they should expect me to share with them by the end of, not necessarily first or second grade, but by the end of lower elementary. We want them to have everything that the Common Core and what we offer. And generally speaking, they will have surpassed those standards by the end of lower L.
And what's neat is that although we will certainly not teach to a test, we have that luxury, and we are not required to meet any particular set of standards, we find that by correlating the Common Core standards and overlaying them with our Montessori curriculum, really empowers the students to see how much they are learning, to look at ways to challenge themselves. And it's a nice framework for us as guides. And this goes into sort of how we measure growth. Of course, the main way being what Bevan described as that observation, whether it's sitting and watching or working side by side with the child. But we're measuring growth, and they're measuring their own growth through self-reflection, which we're modeling regularly and giving them opportunities to practice through those 101 meetings. We watch them during the third period of the lesson, like how they choose to demonstrate their knowledge to assess understanding. We also, because the students have opportunities to teach others and give lessons to other students, there's no greater way to assess true understanding than seeing if a student's successfully able to explain that concept or introduce something to another child. But then they do have that awareness of the societal expectations, i.e. Common Core or whatever it may be, and those types of assessments. We do use some minimal formal assessment at the lower elementary level. We use easy CBM benchmarks, which is administered in the fall, the winter, and the spring. In language and math, which are really, really helpful, not to see how high a student scores, but to really guide the guide in looking at progress, gaps, and informing, how they're teaching. It also serves as a bit of reassurance for parents who've taken a leap of faith in this more alternative educational model, that their children are on track and that we're being held accountable as well, to meet these standards that are out there. And we do write formal progress reports, although not with letter grades, but in fact they're much more in depth because there's a huge checklist of all these different skills and narrative portions about where each child is in every area of the curriculum. So those are just some of the ways that we measure progress. We have not been able to practice this during COVID times, sadly, but a really beautiful part of the elementary curriculum is going out. And Bevan, I've lost track of the time, so can you tell me how we're doing?
It is 5:09.
Oh, okay, we're over. I apologize. Can you briefly describe going out, Bevan?
Sure. Yeah. So to keep it as simple as possible, a lot of what we've already talked about, having those practical life skills and grace and courtesy is important, but the children in the elementary environment want to go out, like literally of the classroom, to explore different things, and we want to give them that opportunity. We purposely do not keep all the books that they might need for certain research in the classroom, so they can potentially go to a library, or they might want to call and meet with an expert. A couple of years ago, we had someone interested in bacteria. They called Johns Hopkins and met with someone that specialized in bacteria. And so the process of, they had to print out the directions. They have to figure out if they're going to need gas. They need to find someone to take them. It's really like everything is on them. And the person that's driving them, even, they have to give the person that's driving them the directions. And then they go and they meet with people, or they get the things that they need for the environment in lower L and bring it on back. There's a lot there that we could talk more about, but yeah.
We'll dive back into that and go deeper when we're able to do this again. Yeah. Just briefly, I wanted to touch on the additional enrichment that's offered at the elementary level. Students have art with our art enrichment guide, Miss Laura, music with our music enrichment guide, Miss Jasmine, Spanish either with Miss Marcella, or if they're in the dual language classroom, they have a Spanish speaking assistant and are receiving the Spanish enrichment woven in throughout the day. They'll continue to have phys ed with Coach Liz, During non-COVID times, the library is a really lively place with students coming in and out and working with the librarian on curating materials for their various research projects. And in non-COVID times, we have many after-school offerings like soccer and cross-country, basketball, yoga, dance, and we really look forward to getting back to a lot of those things that we miss. I'd love to show a very short video. It's only 2 minutes, and then we're going to open it up to questions. But normally, as part of this event, we would have observed in Beven's classroom. And since we're not able to do that, we're just going to take a quick peek. This is not actually Beven's room. This is from a couple of years ago, Mr. JR's room. But you get a sense of what a Montessori elementary classroom feels like. And you'll notice here the classroom assistant is facilitating and sort of getting a group going on a project, but not hunkering down and taking over for them, really just facilitating them getting started on something. And here's
Here you have
doing independent
work.
research.
Yeah.
Sorry, Bevan, go right.
No, you're fine. Yeah, I mean, you'll see there's a group research, there's that independent work and research. There's some children that are working by themselves, some children that are working at, tables together. That energy, that buzz, that we've been talking about is pretty evident at the very beginning of that, almost at the episode, the video. You saw someone opening the door to prepare a snack, and then here's Mr. JR giving a group lesson next to another student that's working independently. So there's a lot that's going on, and it's pretty awesome. I mean, I don't have a better way to say it, really.
Yeah, and some students learn by observing other children's lessons, and that's okay too.
Yeah, absolutely. And you see a variety of work. We've seen math, we've seen people using history books, we've seen writing and language. There's always something different, some other type of curriculum that's going on. It's usually never like everyone's just doing math or everyone's doing geography or what have you. And then here we have the tone bars, and the student is using her grace and courtesy by putting the tone bars back on, accountability for the work, and that's it.
Well, just a quick peek, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen at this point so we can see each other, and we're going to open it up to questions. And I realize we've gone slightly over our hour, so if anyone needs to leave, we will not be offended, but we'd love to take any specific questions that you may have at this point.
I have a question. Since I'm going back to the Excel file that you mentioned about monitoring basically every kid versus every lesson. Is this like only the head guide is doing, or basically all? I don't know if it's 2 or 3. You call it guide and assistant guide. I'm not sure what's the terminology, but does everyone keeping their let's call it observations, or it's just one? How do you go about that, basically?
Yeah, so every guide has their own system, and there are Montessori programs or programs made for Montessori guides. But yeah, it's the guide that's keeping track. If the assistant is keeping track of anything, they're keeping track of maybe observations, and then they're going to share them with me, and that is what I would put into to that thing. But really, the main job of the assistant is to help the flow of the room, to make sure things are going okay, to observe the children, and then help maybe redirect them to work or help facilitate that beginning of the work.
Okay.
Yeah, their job also is to sort of protect the concentration of the guide when giving a lesson, protect that from interruption, and make sure they're answering questions and facilitating conflict resolution, really, as Bevan said, watching the flow. And then as the guide finishes a lesson and gets up, then joining back into sort of the life of the classroom again.
I have another question. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
No, I can ask like 10 questions. So you go ahead, and then I'll come back to.
I'm just curious. When you're moving up to the elementary, how do you make sure? And I know obviously this is a lot of the observe, but if there's certain topics that kids veer away from and certain topics kids veer towards, how do you ensure that they're spending an appropriate amount of time on each of the kind of subject areas?
Sure. So observation's the big one, right? Just to see what they're interested in, what they're not. And then there might be, there are a couple different ways to go about it, but it might be something where they just haven't had enough lessons on something, or there's a lesson that you think might spark their interest in that particular subject area, and maybe two of them haven't landed the way you wanted them to. So it could be giving another lesson. If the child is truly like, I do not want to do this, I do not want to learn how to write cursive, like it's not happening, then I'll sit down and talk, and we'll try to figure out why, right? The thing that we really believe, especially at Greenspring, is that children, they want to do well, right? And the only reason that they're not, and that's not just in they want to do well in just math or just language or just history or whatever, they want to do well in everything. It's something is going to be in the way. There's going to be an obstacle in the way that is preventing them from wanting to do something, right? So an example could be a student that really doesn't want to learn to read and is having anxiety about it or something like that, which I've seen before, and identifying that and sitting down with them and saying, well, let's figure out a way to make this, it could be to make it fun. How are we going to practice this every day? And it might be that, I sit down with a student every morning when they're filling out their work journal and say, all right, today, let's find a way in which we can practice this discipline, right? Or this area of academia, and let's commit ourselves to it. So it could also be too, and this is my favorite example ever, even though the example I'm about to give happened in upper L, but there are plenty of examples in lower. I had a student in upper elementary who loved square rooting, but didn't want to learn how to write like in formal paragraphs and stuff like that. So I asked her, I was like, what do you think about, there's some other children that want to learn how to square root. What do you think about making a brochure or a pamphlet, to sort of help them go through it? And through that, she went, through the process of having to articulate herself in that way. And so sometimes it's crossing the disciplines. There's a lot of ways, and I could keep everyone here much later, so I'll stop.
No, thank you. No.
Sure.
Other questions?
She asked basically what I wanted to ask, because there is every kid has his own natural interest or subject that he's attracted to, and my question was like, how do you basically keep them expose them to to subject that they are less attracted to, and how do you do that on a daily basis? That was basically what I wanted to ask. So thank you for that.
And then I will mention that while we follow the child and give them the freedom to learn at their own pace, there are then times where we start to recognize that a child is having an undue struggle in a particular area. And that is where we sort of ask for help from our student support team to come in and do an observation of the student. And we will work to identify if we suspect there may be a learning difference in a particular area and advise a family if we think, some outside advice or, would be helpful in making sure that we're meeting the needs of the student. The beauty of the Montessori classroom is that we have all this flexibility in the way we structure things and support students. And so, it can be a great place for a child with a learning difference to thrive, but we always want to make sure that we're, giving them everything that we need. So there are times when it's very helpful to have the input of the family and our student support specialist to help guide us. Any other questions at the moment?
I have another question, if you don't mind. So I love the fact that there is like different age groups. But then my question is, because you do have like a curriculum, a concrete curriculum. So then if I'm first year elementary, okay, I need to enter that curriculum, but if I'm a second year kid, then there is a chance I will see this, repetition in the curriculum, or like let's say with what you show with the timetable, like the first like the history lesson, or when did human came to the, so there is kids that will see this lesson 3 times, or how do you go about that in a way?
Yeah, so those 5 grade lessons are repeated every year from 1st through 6th grade. Usually we make it mandatory for the 1st graders, and if the 2nd and 3rds are working on something else, that's fine by me. Every guide has a different way of doing that. Almost always the children want to come back because they're so sensorial. Besides that, the curriculum is not 1st grade, 2nd grade, 3rd grade. It's really not even lower elementary, upper elementary. I have students now and have had students in the past that are doing things that would be traditionally done in upper elementary. And that is another, and then in upper elementary, things that children would be doing past that. The one thing I remember, I had a student a year or 2 ago that came in and said, from a different school, and said, well, I asked, why did you want to come to a new school? Said, well, I knew all my multiplication facts and I wanted to do double-digit multiplication or something, and my teacher said I couldn't do it until next year, right? So the curriculum, there might be a student that thrives in math at 1st grade, and there might be a student that is doing the same thing in 3rd that the 1st year is. It's just where the child is. Our job is to make sure that by the end of lower elementary, they are all on the same playing field, ready to go up in the upper and move on to the next thing. So, so I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, I knew that. Okay, thank you. Yeah.
Sure.
Maybe we could take one more question if there is one before we wrap up this evening. Dave?
I have one question, if I could. So we're evaluating and deciding, do we keep Olivia Greenspring? We've been thrilled with what's happened so far. Part of our decision is not so much, and this might be more you, Margaret, than Beven, is social. So do we start her at her new school, where she's going to probably graduate from high school from, in 1st grade, and then she can develop her peer group at this age and then go all the way to 12th grade? Or do we wait and start her, say, in middle school? If we were to wait, the 3-year clusters of Montessori, we would probably want her to start in 6th grade when the other kids coming in are new. Mm-hmm. But I know, like, from our experience with Children's House, that 3rd year ties a lot of those pieces from the first 2 years in. how do people usually, if they do that, how do they transition? When do they transition? And how does that transition go?
Well, you're speaking my language about the 3 years, because we do think in terms of a 3-year curriculum at the Children's House, lower elementary, upper elementary level. I am biased in that I'm also lower elementary trained, and I see such a value to students having the benefit of that time with the concrete materials and having those aha moments as they graduate to this abstract understanding of things, which tends to happen at this lower elementary time. All that foundation has been laid through Children's House, and now they're making all these leaps and having all these light bulbs go off. And I don't mean to take away anything from upper elementary, because they are still using hands-on manipulatives, but children at that age are doing much more abstract type thinking, and reading and writing and researching. And to me, there's something so precious about these lower elementary years, and not having them switch to an environment where they're going to have it flipped on its head and be taught to memorize and things before they're really quite there. That said, every family makes their own decision about when it's time. We would never write it into our contract or anything. You have to stay for the 3 years. We do ask parents to consider that, not only to have the full benefit sort of that curriculum, but because the 3rd year is the leadership year, and we, such a growth opportunity where things kind of come together and coalesce, that we're always heartbroken, when a child leaves us before the end of the cycle. But you do speak to a very practical consideration, especially at upper elementary. If junior high in Maryland tends to start at 6th grade, you have these hard decisions to make.
So I'm not sure, maybe I misunderstood you. Are you saying that you feel like it's more important for the child to do the full 3 years in lower L than it is in upper L? That missing the 3rd year of upper L isn't as big a deal as missing, say, the 3rd year of Children's House or lower L?
I think it depends on where the child is in their development. Mm-hmm. And I would never wish to see a child miss out on those opportunities. But just in my own sort of bias and passion and love for all things lower elementary, I would encourage you to consider, continuing that gift of the Montessori, into lower elementary, and then sort of reassessing. But that's my own personal bias. And Bevan, perhaps you can speak. You're experienced in both lower elementary and upper elementary, and I don't want to misrepresent.
Yeah, so is it Dave?
It is Dave, yeah.
Just making sure it's not.
Yeah,
okay.
Not Lily. No,
Yeah.
It's not Lily.
So Dave, yeah, I worked in upper L for a year, and actually I spent a lot more time than just that year when I was a substitute. I saw it happen both ways. We saw children leave instead of staying for 6th grade. And there was a child that had been here or several children that had been here for a long time, and they made that decision to move on. But that's not without having in-depth discussions with the guides, and not just the guides, but the school and the families as well, right? So I, as Margaret alluded to, am always like heartbroken when anyone leaves, really. But 6th grade is important too, right? It's not. I understand what Margaret's saying, and the reason that the last part of upper L is important, in my opinion, is because it's more of a leadership role than they've ever experienced before, right? It's very possible that they're going to get academic-wise and everything else the same thing that they might get somewhere else in a different fashion, but I also, as Margaret said, understand when students leave for 6th grade, or like just in general, but that's come up a lot in my experience. So you're not alone in that. Sure. And I would, as Margaret was saying, going through lower L and then reassessing is always.
I think if we started in lower L, we'd want to keep her through at least 5th, and
Sure.
then you start being like, okay, now you're the new kid in 7th grade. Everybody's gotten their year ahead of you, and they've made all their friends, and that's a weird time of life anyway. So it's just kind of balancing a lot of that out.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a hard decision, but at the same time, like I totally understand.
Okay.
What we have heard anecdotally over many, many, many years is that our Montessori students have so many skills, self-advocacy, confidence, independence, they're self-starters, that and grace and courtesy and ability, to get along with others, that when they transition, it's not that it's not difficult. I mean, there's always going to be some changing of the gears and awkwardness there, but that our students thrive because of those experiences that they've been given. I mean, there may be differences of having to raise your hand and ask to go to the bathroom, or eating in a cafeteria and like using a locker, and some of those sort of more practical concerns. But we've also had teachers tell us, my gosh, the student who came from Montessori came up and said that assignment didn't inspire her and she'd like to create her own more challenging, project, and we're blown away, or they come up to me and said, I didn't understand something. Can you help me after class? And, so we just feel that they're such strong human beings, after a Montessori experience, that most will thrive after an initial adjustment period of making that change.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. And thank you all. I'm sorry we kept you so late. If you have additional questions, please reach out to either Beven directly, me directly. We're happy to email, set up a phone call. We love talking about this stuff. As you can see, we could go on forever. So please do reach out. And as you're making your decisions and think of more questions, let us know. We're here for you.